Chances are you don't know this man. His name is Masakazu Kubo, and if we take him at his word, he's the business genius that turned Pokémon from a modestly successful video game series into a global franchise. Born in Sapporo in 1959, Kubo was the eldest son of a Japanese banker. As a child, he exhibited a forceful personality and a love of manga. Kubo wanted to put these gifts to work as a teacher, and his shrewd intellect let him attend Waseda University's School of Education in Tokyo. At Waseda, Kubo became fascinated with childhood sociology and psychology, and he spent a year studying overseas at the University of California, Los Angeles, where he learned English. Despite his impressive accomplishments, after graduating, Kubo wasn't able to secure a job at the school where he did his practicum. He turned his aspirations to the publishing industry instead, wanting to fulfill his childhood passion for manga as an editor. Shockingly, this turned out to be the easier career path, although not without a pretty substantial wake-up call. In 1983, Kubo joined the manga industry's leading publisher, Shogakukan, as a worker in its materials department. In this role, Kubo was responsible for ordering supplies, making account sheets, and managing the nuts and bolts, dollars and cents of publishing. Although it was far from the interesting work of editing manga, Kubo gained a hard knocks education on the business side of the industry. Kubo was eventually promoted to the editorial departments of Shogakukan's TV-kun magazine, and then to monthly Korokoro Comics, Japan's most popular children's magazine. By November 1995, Kubo had risen to the rank of deputy editor-in-chief. While in this job, Kubo was approached by Tsunekazu Ishihara of Creatures Inc., who showed him a prototype of his company's newest video game, Pokémon. After playing the game for a few minutes, Kubo decided right then and there that his company would buy in on the games. What started as a fairly routine business agreement turned into a lifelong friendship that saw Shogakukan become an indelible partner of the Pokémon franchise. Under Kubo's charge, Korokoro began publishing exclusive news and promotions for fans of Pokémon. In August 1996, Kubo himself began pitching the idea for turning Pokémon into an anime. By October 1996, Kubo had laid the foundation for the Pokémon trading card game. In March 1997, Shogakukan's Ladybug imprint serialized a second Pokémon manga, Pokémon Special. In April 1997, the anime that Kubo pitched debuted on TV Tokyo. Despite major setbacks, the anime continued to be a smashing success, with the movie adaptation coming in summer 1998. That same year, Kubo helped negotiate Pokémon's overseas expansion, with the anime, games, and TCG all coming to the United States in September 1998. By November 1999, Pokémon was a worldwide phenomenon worth over $5 billion US. While Pokémon had been a set of games that received critical acclaim, it was the franchise's partnership with Shogakukan, and by proxy, Masakazu Kubo, that developed Pokémon into a globally recognizable brand. This is the story of Pokémon's meteoric rise, as told by Masakazu Kubo, the man who made Pokémania.
Kubo Masakazu, executive producer. そして
Almost every Japanese child knows Pocket Monsters and its star Pakucho.
Finally tonight, it's the biggest thing from Japan since the Power Rangers.
So I watched it and I said, Larry, I don't think this is going to last 13 episodes, but we should definitely do it. And and then it went on and it's still going on. So.
And of course, I was a big advocate. We've got to do this. There's so much tremendous upside. What if it becomes what it's doing in Japan?
でも昨夜6時30分から放送されていたポケットモンスターを見ていて、午後6時50分頃から7時過ぎにかけて突然痙攣や引きつけを起こし、
Nintendo of Japan had very low confidence that Pokemon would work outside of Japan. And most people at the corporate level of Nintendo thought it would never appeal to Western audiences.
So far this year, sales of trading cards, toys, and video games surpassed $500 million in the U.S. Another $4 billion was sold overseas.
We think that at this point we're up to about $7 billion total. And we expect the year 2000 will probably be the biggest year for the franchise ever because of it being so global.
ShoPro, the production company from Japan, was there, and they were managing the process with Nintendo of America, but Nintendo of America was just beginning to get involved, and so ShoPro was like managing the process.
A lot of Pokemon's development history has been covered elsewhere, so I won't browbeat you with it. Here's a quick timeline. In November 1995, Kubo had a meeting with Tsunekazu Ishihara, then president of Creatures Inc., and later the president and CEO of the Pokemon Company. Ishihara invited Kubo to play the prototype versions of Pokemon Red and Green, hoping that Shogakukan would publicize the games as manga. According to a 2016 interview with Time magazine, Kubo says that objectively, Pokemon's prospects weren't great.
No magazine or TV show was interested. They thought Game Boy was finished. No toy makers were interested either.
In spite of that assessment, Kubo saw promise in the fledgling brand. He thought the monsters were cute, and with Shogakukan's prowess in character marketing, Pokemon could become a substantial hit. Alongside Pokemon Red and Green's release in February 1996, Shogakukan's monthly Korokoro magazine began publishing a gag manga featuring the main character Red and his asshole Clefairy. Much as Kubo had anticipated, Pokemon's initial sales were just okay. The games faced an uphill battle since the Game Boy was at the end of its lifespan, and even with Nintendo's backing, the amount of risk involved in distribution curbed their enthusiasm to ship more copies than they could immediately sell. Fortunately, sales were still good enough to attract a few buyers who played the games and discovered, either through glitching or hacking, that there was a 151st Pokemon named Mew. GameFreak decided to take advantage of the gaming community's fascination with urban legends, and created an event to give players a Mew via data transfer. Shogakukan was given first rights to any new information about the games for marketing purposes, so in its May 1996 issue, Korokoro magazine featured advertisements for Mew. Surprisingly, this was the only Pokemon-related content in this edition of Korokoro, but it still had a sizable impact. Over 78,000 children sent in applications for the giveaway. Because of the promotion's success, Kubo was given authorization within Shogakukan to negotiate business deals with Pokemon, independent of his role as a publications editor. Throughout the summer of 1996, Pokemon sales continued to rise, and Kubo helped Pokemon expand into a hydra of media and merchandise. Plans for a Pokemon trading card game were being formed, and a third version of the games, Pokemon Blue, would be distributed through Korokoro magazine as a mail-order item starting in October 1996. The month prior, September 1996, Pokemon hit 1 million sales, an unheard of amount for such a small studio on such old hardware. In the middle of this flurry of activity, in August 1996, Kubo approached the various Pokemon stakeholders with his idea for creating a Pokemon anime. He felt that Pokemon had the potential to become a character business that could last for 10 to 20 years, so long as the games kept coming. In its August 1996 edition, Korokoro featured the first promotion of a Pokemon 2 game, with the legendary Pokemon Ho-Oh as the mascot. The plan was for Pokemon 2 to take at least a year of development time. In reality, it would take almost 3, so the marketing side of the franchise needed to keep children entertained until it came out. Shogakukan had its own production subsidiary, ShowPro, and a good relationship with several animation studios who had been making anime on several of their popular franchises, including Detective Conan and Doraemon. An anime was the obvious solution to the problem of detention economics. Getting everyone to sign on the dotted line would actually be a huge endeavor, because 3 different companies own Pokemon. First on the list was GameFreak, headed by Satoshi Tajiri, Pokemon's original creator. Tajiri was an otaku who loved anime and doujin works, so he was amenable to the idea. But he had one strong condition. Everyone who was involved in making the anime needed to play the games. Tajiri wanted to make sure that the games that he and his company had poured over 5 years into were made to look as cool as possible. Incidentally, this is something that in later years, Kubo took credit for.
I was quite firm that the anime staff had to play the game beginning to end before they started working on the show. That way, everyone on the animation team understood the game world and could do a better job bringing it to life. I think that was the key to its success.
At the second company, Creatures Inc., Kubo had to get the permission of Tsunekazu Ishihara and Benimaru Ashura Itoh. Both men were industry veterans, and while they were enthusiastic about Pokemon's future, they were much less pie in the sky than someone like Tajiri. For a Pokemon anime to work according to Kubo's vision, it would have to last about 80 episodes. Most anime adaptations of games at the time didn't. If Pokemon's anime was cancelled before those 80 episodes, or if it was a bad adaptation that made Pokemon look bad, then it would kill the popularity of the franchise rather than extend it. These were very serious concerns, and Kubo addressed them both by referring to his own experience in media mix projects. Alright, let's go back a few years to the 1980s. Tamiya Corporation had a hot new product, the Mini 4-Wheel Drive. These were plastic cars that kids could drive with a remote controller. They were made out of interchangeable plastic parts and could be raced against one another. They had their own tracks you could build, and they were perfect for indoor competitions and toy stores. In Japan, Mini 4-Wheel Drives became a huge commodity, and in 1989, Tamiya was looking for a way to expand the market and keep momentum going among consumers. They approached Shogakukan, a company known for its character marketing and merchandising, for a bit of help. Shogakukan's solution was Dash Yonkuro, a manga whose plot was centered around Mini 4-Wheel Drive racing, published in, you can probably guess, monthly Korokoro comics. The manga was a moderate success and definitely led to more sales, but in trying to capitalize on their stake, Shogakukan got greedy and turned Dash Yonkuro into an anime. It only lasted 25 episodes, which nowadays would be completely normal, but in 1989 was considered a failure. Reflecting upon Dashion Kuro, Kubo considered it a lesson to be learned and blamed it for the temporary recession in interest in mini four-wheel drive in the 1990s. But Kubo could respond to this failure by pointing to the second attempt at a Shogakukan-produced mini four-wheel drive anime, Bakuso Kyodai Let's Go. Kubo had been involved in the production of both anime, but given his higher standing for the latter, he applied the lessons he learned from Yonkoro to Let's Go to make it more successful. He identified the problem not as the content of the different shows, but rather how they were structured in terms of funding. This next part is a bit technical and you might not find it interesting, but I do, and this is my video, so whatever I say goes. I don't know enough about every anime production before 1996 to know if this is completely accurate or as innovative as Kubo says it is, but this is what he says. Overall, there are 5 basic parties involved in an anime adaptation. The original creator, the studio that makes the anime, the sponsors, the TV network, and an ad agency. Each party invests something and risk is shared. Deals are structured such that each party mitigates risk, so that even if they end up with a rotten egg, they can find some way to make money from it, whether it's royalties, rights to secondary or syndicated TV sales, or some other incentive. Advertising revenue is often the biggest grab for those who don't get direct money from toy sales. But for many four-wheel drive and Pokémon, there was a problem. Children's anime has notoriously low ad buy rates because you can't sell ads for high-value products. Children aren't buying luxury cars, they're buying whatever they can with their allowance. You know, like meth. Because networks don't get high advertising rates for children's shows, they often find it easier to just sell the time slot to an ad agency and let them fill it. In such an arrangement, it is up to the ad agency to find the show and the sponsors. While they take on a lot of the risk, they also take on a lot of the control of production and are generously rewarded if a show is successful. If a show isn't successful though, and it doesn't garner high enough ratings, then the agency just replaces it with something else. This system not only sets up shows for cyclical cancellations and replacements, but it actively encourages it. Merchandising agreements are often stipulated such that the ad agency still gets royalties from merch sales for upwards of 3 years, regardless of whether the anime is on the air or not. It also makes it easier to sell syndication rights, though generally this is the value add that the animation studio gets. As a result, ad agencies are incentivized to replace shows that are still doing well, but not so exceptionally well that the cost of replacing it is too high, and they don't risk burning a bridge with an animation studio because of it. This is effectively what happened with Dashion Kuro. It was a decent show with decent ratings, but since mini four-wheel drives were selling like hotcakes, the people who owned the time slot, Tokyo Agency, were fine canceling it mid-series to find something else that might get better ratings. They would still be receiving revenue from mini four-wheel drive sales for the next 3 years, they might as well increase the pot with some other franchise. In short, there's no loyalty to the anime, especially if the opportunity cost to keep it is higher than the projected ability to get another thing on the air that can generate another revenue stream. To avoid this happening again for a second mini four-wheel drive anime, or for Pokémon, Kubo proposed a different structure. Instead, Shogakukan would become the primary sponsor, buy the time slot from the network or the ad agency, use the ad agency as a partner to find advertisers for the time slot, and pay the animation studio to actually make the anime. Shogakukan was in a particularly good spot to pull this off. ShoPro could handle the amount of work required to systematize the process. The risk would be catastrophic if it failed, but the upsides would be enormous. Shogakukan already had a relationship with the mini four-wheel drive stakeholders and bought in on the boom. They would make money through licensing, magazine sales, and merchandising above and beyond whatever revenue they would make from the show itself. More importantly, they had no incentive to replace it with something else so long as it was doing well. From a purely dollar and cents perspective, this plan was basically a way to buy advertising space for their entire catalog and make some residuals off of it. Kubo doesn't say this outright, but there's also the small fact that, so long as the anime does well and the creators are happy, ShoPro effectively owns the anime. This has the upside that the people invested in Let's Go, or Pokémon, are making creative decisions more than the TV network or an ad agency. And if Kubo is to be believed, ShoPro is a pretty humane licensor, because they pay animation studios before production starts rather than a month after the episode airs. The downside is that creative decisions are also largely in the hands of merchandise salesmen. Their goal is to sell things, not to make something good. Goodwill creators who want their creations to have good anime, like Satoshi Tajiri, can always renege the license, but why would he do that when he's getting advertising and licensing fees for free? This is the same plan that Kubo would pitch to Creatures Inc. and Nintendo to mitigate their concerns over making Pokémon into an anime. And it did work for Creatures. Kubo had earned their trust, and they had already given creative power for a manga adaptation to Shogakukan, so why not an anime? By August 1996, both GameFreak and Creatures had signed off their approval, but Nintendo wasn't on board yet. Nintendo was a large corporation, and notoriously risk-averse with their properties. They never went too deep into the pond of anime production because it was expensive, and also they didn't need to. They're Nintendo. Not only did Kubo need approval from Takashi Kawaguchi, Nintendo's rep for the Pokemon business, but also President Hiroshi Yamauchi himself. Kubo pitched his plan to Nintendo in September 1996, giving a long presentation over several hours where he urged them to make a decision quickly. His goal was to start production in October so that the first episodes would be ready by the April spring season debut. Nintendo put off their decision any further, it was as good as saying no, because the next opportunity to air a Pokemon anime would be the following autumn, and at that point it'd be too late to capitalize on Pokemon's success. Nintendo still demanded time to make a decision. Kubo and his staff left Nintendo's building in an awful mood. They grabbed some beers and hopped on the nearest railway back to Tokyo, certain that they had failed. Choji Yoshikawa, later the associate producer for Pokemon, tried brightening the mood, but it seemed like most of their conversations would only lead back to complaining about their failure. Late in the afternoon, Kubo finally received a phone call from Kawaguchi. He said that President Yamauchi had approved their proposal and told him to call right away. After almost a year of working with GameFreak and Nintendo, Kubo had provided them with a manga, a large distribution event, and now an anime that would air starting in April 1997. The anime was Kubo's biggest single contribution. In March 1997, Pokemon had sold another 200,000 copies, bringing the total somewhere close to 2 million overall. In April 1997, they sold 500,000. Within the second quarter, sales rose to 1.3 million. Between April 1st and the end of 1997, Pokemon games sold 4.7 million. The anime was also a ratings success. The first episode had broken a record for TV Tokyo with a 10.2 ratings share, and ratings only went up from there. The most watched episode of Pokemon was episode 33, The Flame Pokemonathon, in November 1997. Its first movie, Mewtwo Strikes Back, released in summer 1998 and was a box office sensation. It became the highest grossing animated film in Japanese history for a short time, and it still remains the highest grossing anime film in the United States. Whether it's ratings or sales, whatever metric you choose, Kubo's plan to turn Pokemon into an anime had not only extended the franchise's hype for another year, but it had exploded Pokemon into a mania.
Hasbro, one of Nintendo's 100 U.S. licensees, is still fighting to keep up with demand, even after boosting production capacity 20 times.
School officials are finding that Pokemon cards are responsible for fistfights, and the constant trading is not only distracting kids from classwork, but turning the playground into a black market, where they buy and sell rare cards.
You can probably count on one hand the number of Japanese media brands that have ever reached $5 billion in revenue, let alone in 4 years. Of any that you can name, none of them have hit the milestone on domestic sales alone. In order for Pokemon to become a $5 billion franchise by the year 1999, it needed to conquer the world, not just Japan. Extending into foreign markets was difficult. For every Mario or Power Rangers that captured the attention of American children, there were hundreds that failed to find an audience. Powerhouse RPGs like Final Fantasy and Dragon Quest had to be sold on weekends in Japan in order to avoid having children skip school. In America, both struggled to even get all of their products onto the market. Anime was also in an odd middle ground. Popular children's cartoons in Japan might make it stateside, but only at the cost of censorship and the flattening of cultural differences. If Pokemon the game and Pokemon the anime want to succeed in the United States, then it would have to do so at great risk. Enter Masakazu Kubo in Shogakukan. To start off, the story of Pokemon's US expansion doesn't begin in September 1998, when the TCG, games, and anime were all released in the same month. It actually begins in December 1997, when a very famous episode of the anime sent a lot of children to the hospital.
The true story. About 700 Japanese school-age kids were rushed to hospitals Tuesday night, suffering convulsions and seizures after they had watched the bright flashing lights of a popular kiddie cartoon show called Pocket Monsters.
In short, a relatively common animation effect that involves sequencing contrasting colors to create a glowing effect fucked with people's brains and caused headaches, nausea, and seizures. This wasn't the first time the effect had caused a mass panic. In March of 1997, another children's show, Yato Anshin Uchiyo Ryoko, had also sent kids to the hospital after being broadcast on NHK. The reason why Porygon was so much worse is that 1. Pokemon was popular, so more kids were watching it and affected by it, and 2. Pokemon was popular, so the media latched onto it and created a greater hysteria than the episode itself had actually warranted. By the time the Porygon incident was resolved and Pokemon was back on the air in Japan, the show had already made headlines all across the United States, developing a reputation as the seizure show.
And he said, hey, we have this show from Japan, and it's about kids who have these little creatures, and the creatures battle each other. And I said to him, is this the series that sent all the kids to the hospital in Japan? Because at that time it was a big news story. And he said, yes, that's a series, but we're not going to show that one.
In the immediate aftermath, Nintendo disavowed the anime, saying that the games and the show were entirely separate.
Well, I don't think they've made any connection with similar effects in our games. In fact, the Game Boy Pocket itself is a black and white unit that's handheld. but there was something, I guess, in this one episode of the TV show. And the TV show has been on the air since April of 1997, but something special, I guess, was tried in this one episode, which is not clear to me yet. No one's been able to pin down what it was.
Most of the heat for the incident fell onto Shogakukan, and by proxy, Kubo. After all, it was Kubo's brainchild to create a Pokemon anime. He was put in charge of the overall response, and he bore the responsibility for keeping the wheels on the bus going. Kubo and ShowPro's response to the Porygon incident was just to continue production. Just let OLM keep on making the anime, with the risk that they couldn't sell any of it and it would lose money, somewhere in the neighborhood of 120 million yen. In order to keep the sponsors and ad agency happy, the time slot on TV Tokyo was filled by a compilation of the 5-minute anime Class King Yamazaki, which ShowPro had produced for their TV Tokyo variety show Ohasuta earlier that year. As a result of this plan, the Pokemon production cycle stayed in place, even if there were oddities about the sequence of episodes after that. The public's response was overwhelmingly in favor of Pokemon returning, with children writing to Kubo saying that they wanted to see Pikachu again. The hiatus didn't reduce the anime's popularity at all. Ratings continued to dwarf the competition, and game sales reflected the hype, with over 10 million copies having been sold by the anime's resumption in April 1998. The next logical step for the ever-increasing popularity of the Pokemon brand was to expand its reach from Japan into North America. This was a process that Kubo was heavily involved in, long before the Porygon incident took place.
In autumn 1997, I started negotiating with Nintendo of America to get Pokémon broadcast on American TV, just like it had been in Japan. I signed a basic contract with Nintendo of America in 1998. Meanwhile, I was selling film rights and negotiating merchandising deals with Hasbro, the second biggest toy maker in the world. It was difficult deciding what Pokémon's name in America should be, but all those kinds of little details came together to make it a big hit in America.
This part of the story seems kind of surreal at face value. Why was a magazine publisher so heavily involved in multi-million-dollar international negotiations? Normally, a Nintendo property would be exclusively licensed and negotiated between Nintendo subsidiaries, but early on in Pokemon's release schedule, Nintendo of America didn't really care about it. Instead, as Pokemon sales continued to skyrocket in 96 and 97, the licenses for Pokemon were becoming more and more thinly distributed, with the card games going to Media Factory, the anime having ostensibly 5 different owners, and the games being split between 3 different companies. Shogakukan's position as the main sponsor of the anime seems to have given it an enormous amount of power that no other Nintendo property would ever have relinquished. The actual details of this arrangement are incredibly surprising. The games were licensed directly by Nintendo to Nintendo, but the anime, the card games, and several merchandising licenses were all run through Shogakukan to a handful of American companies, namely 4Kids Entertainment and Wizards of the Coast. Of course, Kubo was Shogakukan's Pokemon guy, so he was in the thick of it. As the head of the Japanese side of the negotiations for the non-game products, he apparently had his hands in a lot of different projects. The size of America and how confederated it is between different states and territories was a daunting task for any sort of widespread expansion, though, so Shogakukan itself was directly responsible only for licensing different parts of the franchise to different companies. That didn't stop Shogakukan from trying out a few projects of their own. One of these was the Pokemon newspaper comic strip, which is very sad, and it didn't work for many reasons that would have been obvious to someone who had done due diligence. If there's a term that characterizes Kubo and Shogakukan's overseas negotiations, it's localization. The newspaper comic is just a good example of it. Viz Media, Shogakukan's US subsidiary, could have easily brought over the gag manga, or Pokemon Special, or even the Electric Tale of Pikachu as part of this expansion. Sure, they would have had to censor certain things, like Clefairy twisting Red's testicles, or Misty talking to her breasts, but the United States had a historically large market for comic books and a burgeoning market for graphic novels that something like Pokemon could have easily slid into. Instead, they decided to have Americans run a daily newspaper comic similar to Peanuts or Calvin and Hobbes, without repurposing any old material. The actual work to do this would be pretty intense, but Kubo was a strong advocate for the cause.
We can make this work. Just think of these restrictions as motivation. We've already got a cast of characters, and there's the game's stories that are there too. So it's not like we're asking anyone to start from nothing. We just need to think how we can make something good in the shortest amount of time possible.
Kubo handed off the actual drawing of the comic to Benimaru Itoh. He ultimately figured that if Pikachu had any of the same staying power as Snoopy, then it stands to reason that a comic strip could fill a similar niche. Ultimately, the project was short-sighted because 1. Newspapers were already being replaced by TV and internet media, and 2. Children in America don't read newspapers like children in Japan read Korokoro. Maybe the comics could have stood a chance if they had been published in a similar weekly or monthly magazine like Nickelodeon or Tiger Beat? Probably not though, because they suck.
They weren't very funny, or even entertaining. With very few exceptions, the comics were just plain bad. But honestly, these strips were more likely to make adults hate Pokemon and think it's stupid. On this channel, we usually leave our opinions aside, but most of y'all will never read the comics outside of this video. So we hope you'll forgive us for feeling we need to slip on our reviewer hats.
Obviously, the newspaper comic, as fun as it is to dunk on, wasn't actually a big deal, even if Kubo talked it up so much. The reason I bring it up is because it illustrates two things. One, localization was often self-inflicted by the Japanese. Pokemon gives a good example of this with Brock. ShowPro felt that he looked too Asian, so they replaced him with a white guy because they felt American children would find Brock offensive. Secondly, Japanese businessmen in the 1990s, even great ones, felt a certain amount of condescension in American taste and ability to discern the properties of Japanese media. Localization in this period basically amounted to, let's make things easy for these dumb fucking gaijin to understand. Some of this condescension was short-sighted and harmed their goodwill with fans. For example, children loved Brock, and no one gave a fuck about his non-union white boy substitute. When it comes to Pokemon's localization, I'm putting the onus on Japanese creators rather than American localizers because Masakazu Kubo approved of every change that 4Kids made to Pokemon.
And most people at the corporate level of Nintendo thought it would never appeal to Western audiences. They thought there was too much reading involved in the game and that the anime style of animation wouldn't compete well with the US style of animation. They had their reasons. And so Nintendo approached our company. They said, well, you have a production entity, you have a media buying entity, we might need that. And I said, would you guys be interested in helping us make this, see if we can make a go of it? And this was in 1997. We made money off the TV or merchandise licensing or the TV shows. So we had to make sure that the entertainment worked.
Kubo and 4Kids fundamentally agreed on what it would take for the anime to succeed in America. How do we know this? Well, between the years 2000 and 2002, Kubo wrote several articles for business audiences in publications such as Bunge Shinju, Ronza, the Japanese Echo, the Journal of Japanese Trade and Industry, as well as public platforms such as the Center on Japanese Economy and Business at the Columbia University Business School and the Tokyo Foundation. Each article or seminar deals with a particular topic, but the through line for all of them is some iteration of, Mr. Kubo, Pokemon seems to have the momentum of a runaway freight train. Why are you so popular? Kubo has a couple of case studies he keeps going back to. One of them is the commercial failure of Princess Mononoke in North America, and another is the mild success of Sailor Moon. Princess Mononoke had the double whammy of being animation and therefore kid stuff, while also looking very Japanese. Sailor Moon had the advantage of being aimed at children, but it still featured so much Japanese text and imagery that American children simply didn't relate to it. Now I know what you're thinking, Sailor Moon was a huge success in America, and she is a cultural icon in her own right. But Sailor Moon isn't a $5 billion franchise, and Sailor Moon isn't as popular as Pikachu. Rather than see this disparity as the norm as opposed to Pokemon's exceptional success, Kubo sees Sailor Moon's Japaneseness as a problem that could have been fixed. So the localization of Pokemon names, writing over of Japanese text, the whitewashing of certain Japanese holidays and iconography, turning James into what 4Kids voice actor and later Broadway star Andrew Reynolds referred to as basically the most offensive impression of a gay man you could possibly do without putting a cartoon dick in the character's mouth at all times. All of these were done not only with the permission of Nintendo of America and Shogakukan, but with their encouragement. There may be one exception, but it has nothing to do with 4Kids and everything to do with Warner Brothers, who produced Mewtwo Strikes Back. Kubo was confused why they wanted to change Shinji Miyazaki's orchestral tracks for rap and dance music. He was also bothered by the fact that Warner Brothers wanted to make Mewtwo's role as a villain more clear-cut. Kubo didn't necessarily understand these changes or really like them, but he accepted them as the correct decision because the movie soundtrack went platinum and Mewtwo Strikes Back has outperformed every anime theatrical release since then. The lessons he learned from any of his contentions was that Warner Brothers was right, and Shogakukan was right to trust them. Given the success that followed the transformation of Pokemon into something acceptable for the American palate, however cringe it might have been, can anyone really say that Kubo was wrong?
Pokemoms and dads, beware. Analysts say these cuddly monsters have staying power. They're still going strong after nearly 4 years in Japan. And Nintendo plans to roll out 100 new characters next fall.
I want to end this section by fast-forwarding a bit, because 4Kids and Pokemon's relationship didn't end amicably. In 2006, the Pokemon Company USA revoked 4Kids' license and consolidated everything anime-related under its direction. This was not the first time that the Pokemon Company fucked over one of its business partners. It had done the same thing to Wizards of the Coast in 2003 with the TCG. Kubo had negotiated all these contracts, so what was his take on the 4Kids fucking over? In an interview with Rolling Celts for his book Japan America, Kubo says that he felt swindled by 4Kids. Because of the way Kubo signed the licenses over to 4Kids, the Japanese side of the franchise lost out on a lot of money.
Usually when you think about licensing, you'd think the person who created the original story would make the most money. But American business is designed so that the people at the end, the mass retailers, make the most. Like Walmart. Anything Walmart says, the toy makers do. And they do it for nothing.
But the way the deal was structured for us is that we got a percentage of everything worldwide outside of Japan, except the trading cards.
Okay.
And except the video game.
4Kids did a lot of work for the anime, not just in localization, but in branding. They produced original music, a touring live show, and handled the merchandising and commercial aspects of the anime in America. They came up with the famous tagline, "Gotta catch 'em all." They were very successful at it, and they made a ton of money from it. Too much money, according to Kubo, since most of it didn't make its way back to Japan. By cutting out the greedy Americans like 4Kids or Wizards of the Coast, the original creators could take in all of the money. This is the closest thing to an actual answer for why 4Kids lost a dub, according to the Pokémon Company. Kubo does add, however, that Pokémon could never truly be separate from 4Kids because they would be stuck with the voice actors that 4Kids had chosen back in 1998. Apparently, he knew nothing about the fact that the Pokémon Company USA was going to screw them over one more time. Pokémon Story is a book co-written by Masakazu Kubo and Kenji Hatakeyama, published in 2000. It's the most comprehensive account of early Pokémon's history, and I'd say about 80 to 90% of the video so far draws from this book. I originally imported a copy and tried to make scans of it, but they suck. Thankfully, someone else had tried scanning it on Pokesources.info, but after they left the project, a few of the pages weren't saved. Thankfully again, my translator Wendy also bought a copy and is scanning it in addition to the translations I've asked her to do. So it's been a winding road, but we finally got to this video. In many ways, Pokémon Story is incredibly insightful and detailed about things that most fans yearn to know. In other ways, it's very weird and it raises a lot of red flags. Let's start with the structure. The writer of the main text is Kenji Hatakeyama, an author of television shows, Mansai competitions, travel columns, and historical comedy novels. He's not a journalist, and he doesn't usually write nonfiction, so you might wonder why he's here. The reason is that Kubo needed someone to write a book for him, and he knew Hatakeyama's wife. I'm not saying that to put down Hatakeyama, he's been a professional writer for over 40 years, so he's clearly competent. But as of writing the book, he had no buy-in. The book is meant to be Kubo's story, which is made all the more obvious by the fact that Kubo has marginal notes all throughout the text, either correcting or elaborating on Hatakeyama's narrative. There's a lot of good work in Pokémon Story, like a 30-page interview with Satoshi Tajiri and quotes from executives in all the stakeholding companies. But you always have to keep in mind that Hatakeyama's access to these sources was facilitated by Masakazu Kubo at all times. Also, I can't help but look at the pages and think of them as a visual allegory of a corporate stooge hovering over your shoulder, making sure you don't write the bad things. And that's really the problem. Pokémon Story isn't meant to be a compendium of Pokémon knowledge. It's a ghost-written narrative that asserts Masakazu Kubo's argument for Pokémon's exceptionality as a brand, and his exceptionality as a businessman. And it's not the first book to do that. The Magic of Pokémon was published in March 1998 and seems to be structured to respond to parental complaints about Pokémon following the Porygon incident. The Secrets of Pokémon, published by Shogakukan itself, was released in June 1998, shortly before the games and anime made it to the West. Both of these books heavily feature Kubo as the book equivalent of a talking head. By carrying his name as a co-writer, Pokémon Story is the final boss version of Kubo's argument, that he, more than anyone else, is the gatekeeper to Pokémon's success. That may be an uncharitable interpretation of Kubo's motivations, but there are some very strange inclusions that don't make sense otherwise. Chapter 2-4 begins with a 5-page description of how brilliant and novel Kubo's initial proposal for the anime is. Now that sounds like something that would be really interesting. You might ask what arguments Kubo made for an anime, and how did it fit into the context of Pokémon's other ongoing projects. Unfortunately, we don't get any of that. Instead, Kubo and Hatakeyama talk about the tone of the proposal and how friendly and charming Kubo comes across as. Most proposals don't sound like a personal letter, so this is really interesting and innovative and unique. What a genius that guy Kubo must be. One of the more bald-faced additions, though, is a section that randomly ends with Hatakeyama listing all of Kubo's different roles and titles as of the year 2000. I don't know if Kubo was brushing off his resume or what, but no one else gets this type of treatment. Pokémon Story isn't really unique as a book either. There's an entire publishing sub-industry dedicated to telling the story of an emerging brand or product. The point of this type of writing is to lay a narrative for consumers and journalists to associate with that brand. It's a form of marketing to sell you on someone, or something, not by listing their merits or demerits, or providing factual information, but by telling you their story. Every presidential nominee in the past 20 years has quote-unquote written a biography. In the same way that Donald Trump's Art of the Deal is a book about how cool and good at business Donald Trump is, Kenshi Hatakeyama's Pokémon Story is a book about how cool and good at business Masakazu Kubo is. I have a theory that's not really substantiated, but whatever. Kubo approached Hatakeyama with the Pokémon Story idea around Christmas 1999. A month before, Pokémon Gold and Silver released in Japan, and Tsunekazu Ishihara came to the conclusion that a new holding company to manage the Pokémon brand was needed. This meant that all the negotiating and licensing that Kubo had done in the American expansion would be taken in-house and put under Ishihara's supervision. Shogakukan could keep producing the anime and manga because Japanese companies generally don't do what they did to 4Kids or Wizards of the Coast to other Japanese companies, but Kubo's time as the godfather of Pokémon was coming to an end. Pokémon Story was Kubo's way of making sure that everyone knew what he had done and permanently associated him with Pokémon. Pokémon Story is a highly suspect work, but it's not useless. Kubo isn't going to outright lie and publish false statements. In fact, with some exceptions, the parts that I've been able to verify independently are true. And I trust Kubo's experience as a business wonk enough that I accept that he knows how the structure of the anime industry works. When there are discrepancies between what he says in Pokémon Story and what he or someone else has said elsewhere, that is definitely something worth interrogating. Unfortunately, Pokémon tends to be pretty tight-lipped as an enterprise, and the anime side especially so. There isn't really another book comparable to Pokémon Story to provide the details that Kubo didn't include or perhaps didn't want to be known. While there's not a book, there is a series of columns written by a man who was not only heavily involved in Pokémon, but who was Kubo's equal and opposite as a personality. That man's name is Takeshi Shudo, and I'm about to tell you his side of the Pokémon story. Takeshi Shudo was an acclaimed novelist, stage writer, and anime screenwriter. He was one of the pioneering minds in the early 1980s OVA scene, and he wrote for dozens of anime that were commercial, merchandising, and critical successes. In late 1996, his longtime collaborator, executive director Kunihiko Yuyama, asked him to be the head writer for the Pokémon anime. On the surface, Shudo was one of the best suited people to lead Pokémon. He had experience writing both adaptations of RPGs as well as children's media of every genre, with special note for his ability in writing characters that were appealing to girls. He had a pragmatic sense for how anime should be constructed to make sponsors happy and to market brands overseas. And perhaps most importantly, Satoshi Tajiri and Ken Sugimori were some of his biggest fans. The problem with Shudo was that he was, even in the larger-than-life world of the anime industry, a huge personality. Shudo was a writer's writer, the type who took the art of screenwriting very seriously. He disliked professionally trained writers because they rarely took chances, and Shudo preferred extraordinary scripts even if they led to bad episodes. Most of his script review sessions with writers who worked for him ended up being long conversations about film rather than whatever project they had been working on. If a novel or show didn't interest him, he wouldn't work hard, and on at least 2 prior occasions, he deliberately made creative choices despite producers or advertisers who tried to encroach on his vision. On top of all that, he was, like many of his peers, a functioning alcoholic prone to swings in temperament. A free spirit like Shudo, running into the staunch conservatism of a business mind like Masakazu Kubo, was always going to create friction. What really divided Shudo and Kubo was their vision for what the Pokémon anime should be. Shudo had joined the writing team with the impression that Pokémon would be a 1.5-year long series with about 80 episodes. After playing the games, he understood Pokémon to be like Stand By Me, a discrete experience with a beginning and end centered around the nostalgia for one's childhood and how we grow to accept that loss of innocence in adulthood. Shudo also wanted the anime to have a consistent and expansive lore, building up his own ideas of the Pokémon world and adding logic to a rather grounded fantasy setting. If it was successful, a Pokémon 2 anime could begin with new characters, new themes, and new opportunities to explore the world of Pokémon, which itself could provide a compelling long-term narrative structure for the franchise. Kubo, on the other hand, wanted Pokémon to be Doraemon, a never-ending cute mascot character show that supported a brand that sold merchandise and other products that Shogakukan could profit from. Doraemon has little to no lore consistency. Time never passes, and for that reason, it's an evergreen product in Shogakukan's portfolio that appeals to the broadest possible audience. To the credit of Kubo's vision, Doraemon is incredibly popular and makes Shogakukan so much money that he's effectively their mascot. Shudo wasn't against making a hit anime that sold merchandise. That was something he did extremely well. But not only did he not need Pokémon to be an extravagant hint to be satisfied, he found shows like Doraemon that never went away and never changed to be hugely uninteresting. He had been critical of other long-running anime like Sazai-san for being one-dimensional and following a pattern that allowed for broad appeal at the expense of spontaneity. We have no clue how Kubo viewed Shudo at the time. The only references I've been able to find have been on Kubo's long-since-dead Twitter account. There, he mentioned Shudo's death, and the fact that he went to his memorial held at the Shinbun-Geiza Theater. At least outwardly, Kubo seems to have viewed Shudo as a colleague. Their last meeting in person, according to Shudo, was at a funeral for a mutual friend, and both of them seemed to be cordial to each other. Shudo, on the other hand, talks extensively about Kubo, and not in a flattering way. In the mid-2000s, Shudo was offered a column on the industry website Anime Style where he wrote about his writing philosophy and his extensive career. Most of his columns about writing for Pokémon are actually fairly positive. It was an exciting venture for him, and he found the games really interesting. He also liked most of the people that he worked with. Masakazu Kubo was the exception. Shudo describes Kubo as a controlling, assertive, and passive-aggressive bully who had enough authority to overturn an entire script. He and the members of the writing team referred to him by the nickname Gozen-sama. Kubo led production meetings were nicknamed Imperial Councils. Even though these meetings might have executives from Nintendo and GameFreak attending, Kubo sat at the head of the Imperial Council, with supreme executive power which he wielded through his high-pitched, screeching voice that seemed to evoke a complaining dandy. Shudo felt constrained. In previous anime he worked on, he wrote the dialogue for trailers and end-of-episode teasers, but refrained from doing so for Pokemon out of fear of upsetting Kubo. Shudo gained one victory over Kubo early on in Pokemon's production. Originally, associate producer Choji Yoshikawa proposed having a group of gag villains similar to the Gaikotsu trio from Time Bokon as the main antagonists. Kubo nixed this idea. For what reason, we don't really know. But Shudo liked the idea and suggested that they make Pokemon into a musical anime, in order to trick Kubo into thinking that he was serious and making Team Rocket sound more appealing by contrast. Otherwise, Shudo says he basically did nothing and accepted whatever mandate Kubo gave him. He leaned on Yuyama to let him do what little he could, and resigned himself to writing interesting scripts and waiting out until the finale where he could do whatever he wanted. In Pokémon Story, Kubo describes the production meetings as free-for-alls where everyone got to have their opinions heard. Kubo says that he created the operational structure for the anime and then quietly sat back and watched it go, not wanting to intrude on the creative process. No one else who is quoted in Pokémon Story agrees with Kubo. In fact, Kenji Hatakeyama kind of maybe tries to show the opposite. He quotes Choji Yoshikawa praising Tsunekaze Ishihara, who apparently treated the anime staff well and participated amicably in these meetings. In particular, Ishihara never cut them off, nor said that the anime staff was nothing. Hatakeyama ends the paragraph following this anecdote by asking who had been telling them that. None of the anime staff that are quoted mention Kubo by name, which in and of itself isn't really indicative. But considering that Pokémon Story is Kubo's book, and they praise the other suits and creators who are active in production, it might be a sign of something. Kubo slightly rewords his claim in an interview with Nintendo Online Magazine from the year 2000. He describes his job in the following way.
I oversee the entire series composition. For example, adjusting the broadcast of episodes to line up with the progress of game development and release dates. As for the movies, I'm more involved with their content and art direction, so that's a little more hands-on.
The Japanese term he used here for series composition, series kosei, is the term used to describe the job that Takeshi Shudo officially had. Series kosei is an ambiguous title with a lot of different tasks that can ostensibly be divided between people, but it's also a job that Kubo did not do. Shudo talks about the producer who did do the things Kubo takes credit for. That is, again, Choji Yoshikawa. I won't go heavily into Yoshikawa's backstory, but he had worked with Kubo on Let's and Go, and Kubo assigned him to take care of the day-to-day production of Pokémon. Kubo refers to Yoshikawa in this role as a producer who does series kosei. Kubo also told Yoshikawa that if he succeeded in Pokémon, he would be praised, but if he failed, he'd get all the blame. Kubo said that Yoshikawa would never be able to work for Nintendo again if it failed, but Kubo might be able to introduce him to someone at Sony. Even though Yoshikawa tells this story while laughing, Hatakeyama asks what the fuck bro, and Kubo has to add text at the bottom explaining that he wasn't actually being an asshole. So the evidence being what it is, I'm not inclined to believe Kubo's word over Shudo's. Kubo seems to take credit for things he didn't do while also dancing around the problem of his attitude towards staff, and no one on the staff seems to agree with him even in his own book. In fact, Nintendo president and infamous hardass Hiroshi Yamauchi gave Kubo the pet name Boss Monkey of Monkey Mountain, and said that he and the others tried to avoid making Kubo angry at all times. So in conclusion, yes, Kubo was probably an asshole. So what did Kubo actually do? The nearest I can figure from Shudo's columns is that in the early stages, Kubo attended both production and writing staff meetings, but once the anime had its launch party, he became too busy and only attended the monthly production meetings. Afterwards, Yoshikawa worked as his representative at the writing meetings, and things seemed to improve because Yoshikawa was a lot more pleasant to work with. Shudo later mentioned that Yoshikawa continued sending Shudo merchandise as a midsummer gift even after he left the anime. The writing staff never really had to deal with Kubo after that point either, but Shudo, Yuyama, and Yoshikawa did at least once per month. For the most part, Shudo laid low while attending production meetings. He wrote scripts and avoided confrontation. It wouldn't be until the movie started that he and Kubo really started butting heads. During the production cycle for Mewtwo Strikes Back, Shudo more or less was able to avoid him because Kubo was busy dealing with the Porygon incident. The movie then became a record-breaking box office success, and while Kubo wasn't happy about Shudo's script, he acknowledged that the movie was a hit, and he promised Shudo would have the same authority for the second movie, Revelation Lugia. Then a couple of things happened. After Mewtwo Strikes Back, Kubo set up a huge vacation trip for the anime staff to go to Las Vegas. Shudo decided not to go due to other work obligations and because he wanted to work on the second movie. Kubo took offense at Shudo's refusal, seeing it as Shudo personally snubbing him. From that point on, Kubo's already belligerent attitude turned more hostile, and he began targeting Shudo for criticism at every production meeting. Kubo's promise of creative freedom also came to nothing. First, Kubo asked Shudo to make the title of the movie include the word Bakutan, which was a nonsense word that Kubo thought was cool and marketable. Second, Shudo wanted Revelation Lugia to be an action movie that didn't feature the main cast for at least the first half, but when he submitted a partial draft, Kubo rejected it outright. After that, Shudo rewrote the movie from the ground up and relegated himself to the sidelines again. He accepted certain other creative differences, such as the use of CGI and the fact that they cast a male for Lugia's voice actor. The combination of stress and disappointment led to Shudo abusing alcohol and over-the-counter tranquilizers until he was hospitalized for several months. The second movie eventually came out, and it was also a huge hit, just not as big of one as B2 Strikes Back. Shudo was satisfied with the box office and critical reception, but Kubo saw the declining sales as a downward trend that needed to be fixed by the next movie. When Shudo pitched his idea for the third movie, after having brainstormed it for half a year in the hospital, Kubo immediately rejected the idea because it couldn't be the hit that they needed. Shudo agreed to rewrite the entire movie from scratch and then drank himself back into the hospital. When he returned to the writer's room, Shudo stepped down from the movies and then later from his role as the head writer. He stayed on with Pokémon for another year and a half, at least partially due to the fact that he no longer had to go to production meetings where Kubo was the overlord. Even then, eventually Shudo burned out, and by 2002 he left Pokémon for good. Pokémon did not have another head writer for 6 years. In his anime-style column, Shudo never explicitly says that Kubo was the reason for his breakdown and bad health. But it's pretty clear from his reflections on Pokémon that Kubo's abusive behavior and obsession with creating a huge hit turned Shudo away. Despite the fact that Shudo's free-spirited writing style had led to confrontation with suits before Pokémon, it was the particular belligerence of Masakazu Kubo that left him embittered and sickly until his death in October 2010. It's worth noting that at the same time that Takeshi Shudo was suffering in the hospital and writing movies, Masakazu Kubo was having Kenshi Hatakeyama write Pokémon Story for him. Obviously, the version of Kubo described by Shudo is nowhere to be seen in Pokémon Story, and without Shudo's columns and reflections later on in his life, that Kubo would have been absent from the narrative entirely otherwise. Masakazu Kubo has built a legacy off of Pokémon. Although he was already an editor for CoroCoro before the fateful meeting in late 1995, his reputation and his career exploded with his once-in-a-lifetime acquisition of Pokémon for Shogakukan. Since 2000, Kubo has become an industry-recognized genius of character marketing and brand development, giving lectures, presentations, and interviews for corporations, magazines, and even books. His success with Pokémon has led him to chair on several national boards for copyright, education, and media mix production, as well as serving on 2 visiting professorships at Tokyo University and the Beijing Film Academy. Several anime that you love have Kubo's fingerprints all over them, even if you've never heard of his name before now. Does Masakazu Kubo deserve this legacy, as the man who made Pokémania? I think the question can be read in 2 different ways. Is he a man worthy of getting that credit? And did he actually do the things that made Pokémania? The first question is a tricky one because it involves making personal assumptions about a guy none of us know. And Pokémon fans have a tendency to look for people to blame for whatever decisions they don't like, often attributing everything bad to one particular person. Kubo is certainly not that powerful, especially after the year 2000. And when people live long enough, their lives are complicated enough that you'll often find contradictions in personality and behavior. Who's to say who the real Kubo actually is? Well, let's take some non-Pokémon things he said at a glance to figure out what kind of businessman Kubo actually is. Kubo's problematic behavior towards creators was not a one-off incident with Takeshi Shudo. His attitude towards the creative process was also brought up during a lecture he gave for the Tokyo Foundation in 2003. According to Kubo, producers and artists are always at odds, and it's a producer's job to manage the artist in order to make sure their work is good for business. Artists tend to be selfish, and they only want to make things that they enjoy, and that is not good for business. In manga and anime, the decisions of the producer take priority 90% of the time, though he quips that maybe Studio Ghibli is an exception. The best artist is one that can produce a work cheaply, and one who has no hobbies other than their art, because artists who like things other than anime and manga tend to not be able to focus on work. Artists should be willing to work overnight to get a project done, though Kubo does lament that many younger artists seem to lack that pep in their step these days. While he does acknowledge that producers as a whole are creatively untalented, Kubo believes that they still deserve to be the overseer of the producer-artist relationship. The troubling part is that Kubo's attitude here isn't uncommon. Manga editors are well known for treating their artists like shit. Maybe that's justified for the sake of business, but what's even more odd is how he thinks of fans. The readers, the viewers, the customers, those should be the people most important to a producer, right? Kubo's views on copyright are actually pretty telling. On the one hand, he acknowledges that it is Japanese companies who are responsible for not making their work accessible to non-Japanese speaking fans.
The students told me the Japanese originals are more fun, more entertaining. I understood immediately, and I agreed. But I said, "Do you know that those are all illegal bootlegs?" And their response was interesting. They said, "If you make the original DVD with English subtitles, we'll buy it. Or if you make an official site online, we'll sign up and pay for it." I really believe them. We haven't done that, so they've done it themselves.
As such, Kubo has praised fansubbers and scanlators, and he says that the best solution to pirated media is to help incorporate the fan translators into how Japanese companies do business. On the other hand, when it comes to fan work based off of original creations, he feels that in order to deal with the internet, Japan needs legal reforms that will make someone cry. For anyone who's ever worked with Pokemon footage on YouTube, you know how much of a pain in the ass it is to avoid ShowPro's copyright box. It's an especially weird attitude for Kubo to have, because the creators of Pokemon, the franchise he still hitches his wagon to, was made by guys who put copyrighted anime characters all over their magazine. His anti-creative attitude isn't helped by the fact that he seems to overlook or exploit the people who do the actual work that makes Pokemon. In that Nintendo Online interview where he referred to himself as doing series composition, a job he didn't do, Kubo goes on to talk about the third movie, and he says something really out there.
The movies will be 40% CGI. We're constantly experimenting how Pokemon movements look with this technology. I've really challenged myself this time to make a movie that'll make parents and children alike shed genuine tears.
The third Pokemon movie is one of the most emotionally heavy films in the franchise, and among the best received from a critical lens. It's also the movie that drove Takeshi Shudo out of Pokemon, after he rewrote it to be a love letter to his 5-year-old daughter. This seems like too obvious a point to make, but I think it needs to be stated outright. Kubo did not make that movie. And I don't know what he thinks he did to make that movie. He didn't come up with the scenario, that was Takeshi Shudo. He didn't write the script, that was Hideki Sonoda. He didn't direct the film, that was Kunihiko Yuyama. He didn't design any characters, that was Sayuri Ichiishi. He didn't write the music, that was Shinji Miyazaki. He didn't do storyboards, he didn't draw pictures or do key animation, he didn't voice any characters, he didn't do any of the CGI that he praises so much. He certainly didn't dub the movie into English, that was the voice actors that he and the Pokemon Company fucked over because 4Kids had the audacity to keep the money they generated for the franchise. What did Kubo do besides sit in a boardroom and shout down people's ideas? In fact, what did he do that actually contributed to the stuff that made the movie actually good? All that said, as passionately as I feel about the merit of art for its own sake and the creative reasons why Pokemon has been a success, I live in reality. And in reality, I genuinely believe that Masakazu Kubo was responsible for Pokémania. Korokoro's coverage of Pokemon and Mew gave the franchise its first big thrust into the Japanese consciousness. The anime kept that consciousness going for over 3 years until Pokemon 2 eventually came out, at which point an entire company had to be created to handle all the business of the franchise. There was no reason for Kubo to partner with Pokemon, considering how much business Shogakukan does with Nintendo products, but he found something in there that he thought was compelling, he made an editorial judgment, and he happened to be right. Even after that, he continued being one of Pokemon's strongest advocates. Kubo argued for Pokemon not only to his own company, but to the brand's owners who didn't see the promise of the games early on. His funding strategy created such a stable environment that it's one of the chief reasons that Pokemon is still on the air and hundreds of better shows aren't. The best evidence for Kubo's genius is that ShowPro has basically used the structure he developed for Bakuso Kyodai Let's and Go on most of their toy commercial anime since then. And regardless of what your position on localization is, handing the anime over to 4Kids worked, and it worked so well that it has me questioning whether Americans are just a bunch of dumb gaijin. The actual harmful part about cutting 4Kids off was getting rid of the voice actors, and as far as I can tell, no one in Japan was aware of or even supportive of that decision. That was an American company, deciding to fuck Americans over. While Shudo's characterization of Kubo as overbearing seems to have been shared by his colleagues, that doesn't mean all of his gripes are legitimate. Kubo was hardly the first executive Shudo butted heads with, and while Shudo understood his place in the Pokemon machine, it was clear that he wasn't happy about it. While Shudo's grievances often come down to a personality clash, it's also true that artists are slaves to their own vision, sometimes their ideas are just bad, and sometimes they just need to be told no. Finally, this is not something I say lightly or without empathy, but Shudo was a drug addict, and his unconventional scripting sessions likely did more harm to his mental health than fighting with some guy in a suit, no matter how much of an asshole he was. I'd imagine that 90% of the people watching this video don't know what an executive producer actually does. Before making this video, I don't think I ever cared. It's not a sexy job like writing or animation, and the people who do it well are often people who have to be disliked. Sometimes you just need an adult to get everyone onto the bus. That's often a thankless job, and it's one that requires a disciplined attitude that makes you unpopular. There is a timeline where Takeshi Shudo got to make his original vision for the third movie, and it was pure cinema. But there's also a timeline where Pokemon ended after episode 37, because the suits in charge didn't have that aggressive, winner-takes-all attitude that made Kubo put his career on the line to make Pokemon work. Pokémon could not be a $5 billion global enterprise without people like Kubo at the helm. More than likely, it would have been a flash in the pan, easily forgettable 1990s RPG that never made it to America. Lord knows there's hundreds of such cases. The best person to speak on what Kubo did for Pokemon is Benimaru Itoh of Creatures Inc., an artist if ever there was one. Itoh summed it up so nicely that I'm ending with his words.
Pokemon was created because we were children, but there was one person who possessed the power of the dark side of the adult world, who was loud and forthright. But you could also say, it was because of this person that we were able to maintain a healthy production system in this adult world where anything can happen. That person was Kubo.
Hi there again, folks. As I mentioned in the video itself, my translator Wendy bought and scanned a copy of Pokémon Story to put on archive.org. It should be downloadable as of the posting of this video, and it's an invaluable source if you want to know more about Kubo or early Pokemon's history. Since my last video on the episodes written by head writer Takeshi Shudo, SOS Subs has also released subtitles for Advanced Generation, which you can find on their site. I made a video about subtitled Pokemon earlier about that, but someone decided to be a snitch on YouTube. The video is uploaded on Dailymotion, you can find that link in the description. See you next time!